At a family picnic, my son-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "Go wash up in the river, you stinkin' farmer." And everyone laughed. I stood up, said quietly, "Remember this moment? This is where it ends for you," and walked away. The next day, I vanished without telling anyone, and within an hour, every news outlet exploded with headlines. But he never knew. While he was planning to steal my land, someone from inside his own circle was already warning me. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. Justin organized the picnic himself. That alone should have told me everything. In 37 years of knowing my daughter, she never once suggested a family gathering on the Cumberland riverbank. That was always my idea. Always Dorothy's idea. Always something that belonged to us. But 3 Saturdays ago, Justin Urban called my cell phone with that smooth, practiced voice of his and said, "Fred, we're doing a family thing by the river. Come on out." Like he was inviting a neighbor, like I was an afterthought at my own family's table. I came anyway. I brought the fish I'd caught that morning on my stretch of the Cumberland. 6 fat channel cats I'd pulled in before 7 a.m. with a fly rod that belonged to my father. Nobody asked me to bring food. I just did, because that's what you do when you're raised right. Justin was already holding court by the time I arrived. He stood near the cooler in a linen shirt that probably cost more than my first truck, talking to the Hargrove couple from next door, neighbors I'd known for 20 years, as if he'd known them his whole life. He was explaining with great authority what Wilson County land was worth per acre in the current market. "See, the issue with inherited farmland," he was saying, as I set my cooler down on the picnic table, "is that it just sits there, depreciates in opportunity cost. A parcel like Fred's could generate real returns if it were developed correctly." He glanced at me when he said it, not at me, through me. "No offense, Fred." I didn't say anything. I started cleaning the fish. My daughter Victoria, my Victoria, who I put through Vanderbilt Law on the back of 12 Angus cattle and 300 acres of Tennessee tobacco, was sitting on a blanket nearby, watching me with the expression she'd been wearing for about 2 years now. Not cruel, just absent, like a light behind a window that used to be on. Zinnia Walters sat beside her. Zinnia was Victoria's friend from the city, a journalist with the Nashville Banner who'd been to our farm exactly twice, and somehow always showed up when something was happening. She had a camera bag over her shoulder at a family picnic, which struck me as odd. I filed it away. Lauren DeSantis, Victoria's half-sister from her mother's second marriage, was on a folding chair eating potato salad and checking her phone. Lauren and I had never been close. She appeared at events the way certain birds appear before storms. "I am Fred Evanson. I'm 67 years old. I farm 2,847 acres. No, wait. I farm 340 acres at 2,847 Evanson Farm Road in Lebanon, Tennessee, 14 miles outside Nashville. I grow tobacco and corn. I raise Angus cattle. I've been on that land since I was 31 years old, and before me, my father was on it, and before him, his father built the first fence post. I've got rough hands and a quiet mouth, and I have been underestimated by better men than Justin Urban." The afternoon moved slow and hot, the way July afternoons do in Tennessee. I cooked the fish over a charcoal grill I'd brought in the truck bed. Justin made a show of not noticing. He circled the conversation back to land values twice more, each time a little louder, each time landing a little closer to what he actually wanted to say. Then I went into the river. It was hot. The Cumberland was cool. I waded in up to my chest with my boots off and my jeans rolled, the way I'd been cooling off in that river since I was a boy. It felt like mine because it was mine. That stretch, that water, that afternoon. When I came out, my shirt was damp and my hair was flat and I smelled like river water and sunscreen, and I did not care, even slightly. Justin was waiting. He said it loudly, deliberately, so everyone could hear. Victoria, Zinnia, Lauren, the Hargroves, a family I didn't know from the next blanket over. He said, "Go wash up in the river, you stinkin' farmer." The laughter came fast. Not everyone, but enough. Lauren's smile appeared before the sound did. Zinnia raised her camera. I picked up my towel from the bench. I dried my hands slowly, one finger at a time. Then I looked at Justin Urban directly, and I let the silence sit for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the laughter to start fading, long enough for him to feel it. I said quietly enough that everyone had to stop talking to hear it. Remember this moment. This is where it ends for you. I put the towel down. I walked to my truck. I drove home. In the glove compartment, there was an envelope. I'd put it there myself 3 months ago. I'd written on the front, "Do not open until August 15th, 2025. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was inside. 3 weeks before that picnic, I had driven to Murfreesboro on a Tuesday morning and signed a document in front of a notary public on the second floor of an office building on South Church Street. The notary's name was Patricia Odom. She was professional, careful, and completely bound by client confidentiality. Whatever I signed, nobody knew. Yet. The farm was quiet when I got back. I fed the cattle. All 12 of them. Dolly, Chester, the 7 I hadn't bothered naming, the 3 calves born in spring. I checked the fence on the north pasture where it had been leaning since April. I walked the length of the tobacco row nearest the house and checked the leaves for hornworm damage. Then I went inside, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. I was not angry. That's the part people would find hard to believe. I had moved past anger sometime in the spring, the way you move past a town on the highway. You see it, you note it, you keep driving. What I felt, sitting at that table, was something closer to clarity. I thought about the first time Justin Urban came to this farm. Victoria had brought him out for Thanksgiving, 6 years ago. He'd worn city shoes and stood in the doorway of the barn like the smell personally offended him. Dorothy had been alive then, and she'd made her sweet potato casserole and her cornbread, and Justin had eaten 2 helpings of everything and told her it was surprisingly good. Dorothy had smiled and said thank you, and later, when we were alone washing dishes, she'd said to me very quietly, "Fred, that boy is going to be a problem." I told her she was being unfair. Dorothy was almost never wrong about people. I should have listened harder. I remembered a Sunday afternoon about 2 years back, when I'd driven into Nashville to surprise Victoria for her birthday. I got to their building and rang up, and Justin answered the intercom. He didn't know it was me. I heard him say to someone, I still don't know who, "It's the old farmer. Can you believe he just shows up?" Then a pause, then laughter, then, "I'll handle it." He came down and was perfectly pleasant, shook my hand, told me Victoria was at brunch with a friend and would be back soon, invited me up for coffee, smiled the whole time. I drank the coffee. I drove home. I did not tell Victoria what I'd heard. That was when I started paying attention differently. A man who laughs at you in private and smiles at you in public isn't charming. He's strategic. And strategic men, in my experience, are always working towards something. The question is what, and how far they're willing to go to get it. Over the following months, I watched. I'm a patient man. Farming teaches you that. You don't rush the corn. You read the soil, the weather, the signs that most people walk past without seeing. You wait. What I saw, Justin started asking questions about the land. Casual questions, always sideways, never direct. "What would you say the whole property is worth these days? And have you ever thought about what happens to the farm, eventually?" And once at Christmas dinner, with his arm around Victoria's shoulder and his wine glass half full, "A parcel like yours, the right developer could really unlock that value, Fred. Just something to think about." I thought about it, differently than he meant. By February, I had made a decision. By March, I had made an appointment. By June, I had hired 2 people, a land attorney named Luis Villarreal, whose office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Athens Way in Nashville, and a private investigator named Walter Griffin, who didn't advertise and came recommended by Luis and had spent 22 years as a special agent before going private. I didn't tell anyone. Not Victoria. Not a single neighbor. Not my brother in Knoxville. Dorothy had a saying she got from her own mother. "The fish that stays quiet doesn't get caught." I don't know where that came from, but I've been turning it over in my mind since March. What Luis helped me build was quiet, legal, and ironclad. What Walter started uncovering was something I had suspected, but hadn't dared name out loud. Not yet. The morning after the picnic, I did not go back to the farm. I drove into Nashville before dawn. I checked into the Lowe's Hotel on Broadway under my own name, no reason to hide, and I sat in a clean room on the 9th floor and watched the city wake up. I ordered coffee from room service. It cost $11, which struck me as unreasonable, but I paid it. My phone was off. I knew Victoria would call. I knew Justin would not. I was not hiding. I was letting the silence do its work. Sometime mid-morning, I turned my phone on briefly, just long enough to send one email to an address I had set up 3 months ago, linked to a draft that had been sitting there since July. The email contained one word: send. Somewhere across Nashville, the Nashville Banner's editorial desk received a press release. One paragraph, no signature. It described in general terms a Wilson County landowner making an unprecedented decision about his property. The text ended mid-sentence, deliberately. I turned my phone off again. I thought about Dorothy. Not with grief, I was past the worst of that, but with something that felt like consultation. She spent 41 years helping me build something that belonged to 3 generations of Evansons, and I was not going to let a man in linen shirts dismantle it through patience and charm and the slow erosion of my daughter's judgment. The envelope in my glove compartment was still sealed. Somewhere in Wilson County, reporters were already driving toward Lebanon, and in Murfreesboro, a notary named Patricia Odom was politely declining to answer any questions about what Fred Evanson had signed 3 weeks ago, because she was bound by law to do exactly that. I ordered a second cup of coffee. $11 again. Still unreasonable. I opened the curtain and looked at the city below, and I thought, Justin thinks this is a tantrum. He thinks I'll cool down, come home, and go back to being the stinking farmer who knows his place. Some men are slow learners. He was about to get an education. I stayed at the Lowe's for 2 nights, not because I needed to. I'd arranged for Pete Hargrove's boy, a 22-year-old named Cody, who'd worked my south field for 3 summers, to check on the cattle twice a day. Cody was reliable and asked no questions, which are the 2 qualities I value most in temporary help. I stayed because I wanted to think, without the farm filling every quiet moment with something that needed doing. In a hotel room, the quiet was just quiet. I turned my phone back on the following morning. 41 missed calls. Victoria, Lauren, 2 numbers I didn't recognize. One from my brother in Knoxville. I hadn't spoken to him in 4 months. There was also a single text from a number I'd never seen. Be careful. Justin already signed a preliminary agreement with Harvest Global. There's a document. I read it 3 times. I wrote the number down on the hotel notepad and circled it. I didn't know anyone called Harvest Global. I didn't know who had sent the message. But someone out there knew things about Justin's business that I hadn't learned yet, and they'd chosen to warn me instead of staying quiet. That was worth remembering. I called none of the 41 missed numbers. I checked out, settled the bill. 2 nights, $347, unreasonable as always, and drove back to Lebanon. The Nashville Banner was on the kitchen table. Cody must have picked it up from the end of the drive. The story was below the fold on the front page. Wilson County farmer transfers $1 million land holding to Conservation Trust. Family says they knew nothing. I read it once. Accurate as far as it went, the reporter had pulled the quitclaim deed, filing at the Wilson County Register of Deeds, Section 4, dated the 3rd of August. The article quoted an unnamed family member calling the decision completely out of character and deeply concerning. I suspected Lauren. She had a gift for phrases that sound grieved but mean something else. I folded the paper and made real coffee. Victoria called again while I was drinking it. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was careful and controlled. Her lawyer voice, the one she'd learned to wear like a coat. She said she was worried. She did not say she was sorry. I thought about that for a moment. Then I went out to fix the fence on the north pasture. Physical work organizes the mind the way nothing else does. I'd spent 6 years watching Justin's methods, the way he'd reframe what Victoria said until it meant something slightly different than she'd intended. The way he'd raise the subject of the farm, always when she was tired, always at the end of a long week. Imagine what you could do with that money, Vic. Imagine the freedom. as if the land were a burden she carried out of loyalty to me. What he'd never understood, never bothered to ask, was that Victoria had loved this land before she'd ever met him. She'd learned to drive on the Southfield Road. She'd caught her first fish in the Cumberland standing next to me. He'd managed to make her half forget that. That was his real talent. I drove the last fence post in and put the equipment back in the barn. Justin had a plan. It involved the farm, someone called Harvest Global, and Xenia Walters, who had brought a camera bag to a family picnic and was apparently connected to something she hadn't disclosed to Victoria. I still didn't know how the pieces fit, but I knew someone who was working on it. I washed my hands and called Walter Griffin. He picked up on the second ring. "That text last night," I said. "Was it you?" A pause. "No." I didn't think so. We talked for 11 minutes. He'd been running down Justin's business affiliations for 6 weeks and hadn't found Harvest Global yet, but he was looking harder. He'd identified the land broker Justin had been meeting, a man named Gary Sims, licensed in Tennessee and Georgia, office on Gallatin Pike in East Nashville. I wrote it down. "One more thing," Walter said. "Xenia Walters attended a real estate investment conference in Brentwood about 2 years back. She wasn't there as press. She signed the attendee list as a representative of a Delaware LLC. What LLC? Still working on that. After we hung up, I sorted through the mail. At the bottom of the stack was a business envelope from a Nashville law firm I'd never heard of. Not from Victoria personally, but from her firm. It requested, in formal legal language, that Fred Evanson submit to a neuropsychological assessment to evaluate his mental capacity. At the time of signing the documents, dated the 3rd of August, I read it twice. Set it beside my coffee cup. Justin had moved faster than I expected. I gave him that much credit. I picked up the phone and called Luis Villarreal. The phone rang twice. When he answered, his voice was even, unhurried. The voice of a man who had seen this kind of letter before and knew exactly what to do about it. I told him I needed to see him in the morning. He said 7:30 worked. He did not ask why. Luis Villarreal's office on the 3rd floor of 220 Athens Way told you something about the man before he spoke. No diplomas on the walls. Just a framed topographic map of Wilson County behind his desk. A clean surface, a legal pad, a pen he clicked once and set down. I handed him the letter from Victoria's firm. He read it in under a minute, placed it on the desk, and folded his hands over it. "They're going to argue diminished capacity at the time of signing," he said. "It's the only viable angle. Tennessee law on irrevocable agricultural trusts is tight. Once filed and recorded, the reversal standard is very high. Proving you weren't fully competent when you executed it is their only real path." "I was fully competent," I said. "I know." He opened the desk drawer and produced a manila folder. "Which is why I had you seen at Vanderbilt Medical Center 3 weeks before we signed anything." He slid the folder across. Inside, a 12-page neuropsychological assessment from Dr. Anita Okonkwo of the Vanderbilt Department of Neurology, dated well before the Murfreesboro signing. The summary on the final page noted no evidence of cognitive impairment and listed my cognitive index score at 118. I closed the folder. "You planned for this," I said. "You hired me to plan for this," Luis said. "They'll bring in their own expert. We'll bring in Dr. Okonkwo and a video recording of the full signing session, notarized and time-stamped, with Patricia Odom conducting and me present as counsel. Every step documented." He paused. "They will spend considerable money trying to prove something the evidence directly contradicts." I thought about Justin writing that check, a quiet satisfaction I kept to myself. "There's something else," I said. I told him about the anonymous text, the name Harvest Global. Luis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he wrote the name on his legal pad. "I'll pull Delaware registrations," he said. "If Harvest Global has any Tennessee real estate presence, it'll be in the record. Walter is on the LLC angle." "He is." "Good." He tapped the pen once. "Fred, the trust is solid and the competency challenge is manageable. What concerns me is the full scope of what Justin was building and whether there are parties we haven't identified yet." That was the thing I couldn't stop turning over. A man like Justin didn't operate alone. He was good at positioning himself, but he needed infrastructure. someone to run numbers, someone with document access, someone who could move things without leaving clear tracks. Walter told me Zinnia Walters attended a conference with Justin 2 years back, I said. She wasn't there as press. She signed in as a representative of a Delaware LLC. Louise was already writing. I read from the follow-up Walter had sent that morning. Conference at a hotel in Brentwood. Attendee list semi-public. Zinnia had signed in on behalf of an entity called Urban Walters Land Consulting, registered in Delaware. Louise set his pen down. Urban Walters, he said. Urban, as in Justin Urban. We looked at each other across the desk. Co-registration, Louise said. Both names on the LLC. She's not a family friend who happened to bring a camera. She's a partner, he paused, which means Justin brought her to that picnic deliberately, to watch. I sat with that. The picnic organized in my honor had been, in part, a business reconnaissance. Zinnia's camera bag was a tool, not an affectation. I'd noticed it at the time and filed it away. Now I understood what I'd been filing. Next step, I said. I filed the formal response to the competency challenge this week with full documentation. That closes that door. He picked up his pen. Walter keeps pulling on Urban Walters and Harvest Global. When we have enough, we decide what to do with it. I drove home through Wilson County in the late afternoon. The gravel road into the farm made its familiar sound under the tires. After dinner, I went to my study and spread out the 1962 USGS topographic map of Wilson County, bought at an estate sale in Carthage for $4, with my own pencil annotations showing every fence line and access road on all 340 acres. My grandfather broke the first acre in the north field with a horse-drawn plow. My father built the main barn in 1961 with lumber he'd milled himself. I had spent 36 years improving what they'd started, keeping the books to the penny. Justin Urban had never once asked me about the history of a single acre of it. He'd looked at the land the way certain people look at furniture in a house they plan to inherit, cataloging value, calculating use, waiting for the current occupant to become inconvenient. My phone buzzed, a message from Louise, pulled Delaware records. Urban Walters Land Consulting, LLC, registered 2022. 2 members, Justin R. Urban, Zinnia M. Walters. Still running Harvest Global, nothing in Tennessee yet, but 3 related entities in Georgia. Sending Walter details now. I typed back, good. Then I sat with the map and the lamp and understood, with the certainty you feel before a change in weather, exactly how badly Justin had miscalculated. He had spent 6 years preparing to take something from a man he believed was slow and sentimental and easy. He had not once considered that the slow, sentimental man had spent the last 8 months preparing too. My preparations were already filed in the Wilson County Register of Deeds. His were sitting in a Delaware LLC that now had Luis Villarreal's complete attention, and Walter Griffin's. I folded the map, put it away, and turned off the lamp. Some things you plant in spring and don't harvest until fall. The patience required is not complicated. You simply have to mean it. I went to bed. Walter Griffin called me on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after my meeting with Louise. I was in the barn checking the water lines when my phone rang. I set down the wrench and answered. Gary Sims wasn't the only broker, he said without preamble. That was one of the things I appreciated about Walter. He didn't waste the first 30 seconds of a phone call asking how you were doing. Tell me, I said. Urban Walters Land Consulting has been active since late 2022. I pulled their filing records from Delaware, cross-referenced with Tennessee business activity. They held negotiations with a company called Harvest Global on at least 4 separate occasions. The last meeting was documented 6 weeks before the picnic. A pause. Harvest Global offered $4.2 million for the full 340 acres. Sims brokered the terms. Zinnia Walters signed as co-representative for Urban Walters. Justin signed as managing member. I was quiet for a moment. And Harvest Global, who owns it? That's where it gets interesting, Walter said. Harvest Global is registered in Georgia. Its sole listed director is a man named Raymond Foss, address in Savannah. But Fossey has no verifiable real estate background. No license, no professional history, no public record activity before 2021. The company's registered agent is a law firm in Atlanta that handles a large volume of offshore adjacent entities. He paused. My Riyadh is that Fosse is a placeholder. Someone put him there to create distance. Distance from whom? Still working on that. There it was. Two new threads pulling in opposite directions. The first, who actually stood behind Harvest Global and why they needed that much separation from a land purchase in Wilson County, Tennessee. The second, how Zania Walters, a newspaper journalist, had become a co-representative of a Delaware LLC negotiating a $4.2 million agricultural acquisition. I thanked Walter and told him to keep pulling. The following day, Luis filed the formal response to Justin's lawsuit. He sent me a copy by email. The document was 31 pages, which Luis told me was longer than strictly necessary, but thorough enough that any judge reading it would understand exactly what was in front of them. Attached to the filing, Dr. Okonkwo's neuropsychological assessment, the time-stamped video of the signing session in Murfreesboro, and sworn statements from 3 neighbors, Dale Coombs, Margaret Pruitt, and Pete Hargrove, all confirming that I had discussed my intentions regarding the trust with them individually, starting the previous May. I hadn't asked them to remember that. I'd simply told them clearly and in separate conversations what I was planning to do with my land and why. I'd done it because a man who keeps his decisions entirely private can be portrayed as erratic. A man who speaks openly to his neighbors about his choices months in advance is harder to paint that way. Justin's attorney must have seen the filing within hours. Luis told me later that his assistant had fielded a call from the opposing counsel that same afternoon, asking for a settlement conference. Luis declined politely. There was nothing to settle. Meanwhile, I received a call from the number that had sent me the anonymous text. Not a new message. The phone actually rang, which surprised me. I answered. Silence on the line. Then a click. The call dropped. I called Walter immediately. He ran the number again. Same result as before. A prepaid device purchased with cash at a convenience store in Memphis. Activated once. Never topped up. The tower ping placed it in the Midtown Memphis area at the time of purchase, which covered about 6 square miles and meant nothing useful. Whoever had warned me didn't want to be found. I respected that, even if it frustrated me. Walter spent another week on it and came back empty. I told him to close that thread and focus on Harvest Global. What I couldn't explain and couldn't stop thinking about was how the caller had known about the preliminary agreement with Harvest Global before I did. Walter hadn't uncovered those documents until weeks later, which meant the anonymous warning had come from someone with direct access to Justin's business dealings, someone on the inside. 3 days before the scheduled hearing at Wilson County Circuit Court, Walter called again. His voice was different this time, flat and careful in the way it gets when he's telling me something that requires my full attention. Justin met with someone last night, he said. The parking lot of the Cool Springs Galleria, 9:14 p.m. I was watching. Who? The Honorable Samuel Birch, assigned circuit judge for the trust invalidation case. I sat down on the porch step. How long were they together? 11 minutes. Justin handed him an envelope. Birch put it in his coat pocket. They didn't shake hands. Walter paused. I have photographs, clear ones. I told him to send them to Luis immediately, and to hold his original copies somewhere secure. Then I hung up and sat on the porch for a long time, watching the cattle move slow and easy across the south field. Justin had just made the kind of mistake that changes the nature of a situation. He had crossed from civil dispute into federal territory, and he had done it 2 days before his own hearing, which suggested either desperation or a level of arrogance that I genuinely hadn't expected. I had given him credit for being strategic. I had underestimated how much he believed his own reputation protected him. Luis called me within the hour. He had reviewed the photographs. His assessment was direct. This goes to TBI tonight. I'm not waiting. I told him I agreed. The hearing was in 2 days. Whatever happened next was no longer just about the trust. I arrived at the Wilson County Circuit Court in Lebanon at 8:30 on the morning of the hearing. I drove myself. I wore my good boots and the dark jacket I'd last worn to Dorothy's funeral, which felt appropriate in a way I didn't examine too closely. There were 3 camera crews in front of the building. That surprised me. I'd expected local interest. The Banner had run 2 follow-up stories on the trust filing, but the presence of Channel 5 and News Channel 4 alongside the Banner's own camera meant someone had made calls. I didn't know who. I walked toward the entrance, and a reporter I didn't recognize stepped forward with a microphone. "Mr. Evanson, are you aware that Judge Birch has recused himself from your case this morning?" I stopped. I looked at the camera. "Where did you hear that?" TBI confirmed it at 7:15. "The case has been reassigned to Judge Carol Weston in the 17th Circuit. Can you comment on the reason for the recusal?" I said, "I'm here for a hearing. I'll go in now." And I walked past them into the building. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Luis was waiting. He looked the way he always looked, measured, unhurried, completely unreadable to anyone who didn't know him. I'd learned that when Luis stood that still, things were moving very fast somewhere nearby. "TBI moved faster than I expected," he said quietly as I approached. "Is that a problem?" "No. Judge Weston is solid. She's seen every kind of trust challenge in this state." He adjusted his cuffs. "Justin's attorney is already here. Justin is in the hallway near the east entrance. He looks like a man who hasn't slept." I looked down the corridor. I could see Justin at the far end, standing with a man I assumed was his attorney, a tall, gray-suited figure who was speaking in low, rapid tones. Justin was listening with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He was wearing a suit that had cost more than my propane bill for a full year, and his face had the particular pallor of someone whose morning had not gone the way he'd planned. He saw me. Our eyes met across about 40 feet of courthouse corridor. He looked away first. Zinnia Walters was near the east entrance as well, but she wasn't standing with Justin. She was standing alone, slightly apart from everyone else, in a dark coat with her phone face down in her hand. She had the expression of someone who had recently been told something they wished they hadn't heard. The camera bag was gone. The hearing itself lasted 47 minutes. Judge Weston reviewed Luis's filing, questioned both attorneys briefly, and denied Justin's motion to compel a competency evaluation. Her reasoning, as I understood it from Luis afterward, was straightforward. The documentation provided by the respondent, meaning me, constituted sufficient prima facie evidence of capacity at the time of execution. The burden of proof for overturning an irrevocable trust in Tennessee was high, and the petitioner had not met it. Justin's attorney requested a continuance to gather additional expert witnesses. Judge Weston denied that too. Justin's face, when the ruling was read, was the kind of face a person makes when they've bet on something that was supposed to be certain and it comes up wrong. The color went out of it in a way that took maybe 3 seconds. I was watching from the gallery, and his jaw worked slightly, like he was adjusting to new information his brain hadn't finished processing. His attorney put a hand briefly on his shoulder and said something. Justin didn't respond. Outside the courthouse, there were more cameras than before. The story had grown. Somewhere between 7:15 and 10 o'clock, word of the TBI connection to the recusal had moved through Nashville's media circuit with the efficiency that only genuine scandal produces. A Nashville, Tennessean reporter found me on the courthouse steps. She was young, serious, with a recorder already running. She asked, "Mr. Evanson, the judge's recusal this morning, the TBI investigation, were you expecting any of this when you made the trust transfer?" I looked at her. I thought for 1 second about Dorothy, who had always said I gave too little away in conversations and too much to strangers who showed up at the farm selling things. I said, "I'm a farmer. We're used to waiting on the harvest." She wrote it down. I didn't read the afternoon edition. Luis drove me back to Lebanon. He told me Justin's attorney would file an appeal on the trust ruling within 10 days. It wouldn't succeed, but they'd file it. The TBI investigation would move separately. He pulled up to the farm gate and stopped. "You did this correctly," he said. "I had good help," I said. I got out and went in. That evening I was in the kitchen when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I answered. "Dad!" Victoria's voice, the lawyer voice, was gone. What was there instead was something I hadn't heard in a long time, something younger and afraid. "Victoria!" I didn't know about Harvest Global. I need you to believe that. I knew Justin wanted the land. I knew that. But I didn't know there was a company or an agreement or... She stopped. I didn't know. I held the phone and looked at the window above the sink, where the kitchen light reflected against the dark glass, and I could see my own face looking back. I believe you, I said, and I did. But I want you to ask yourself one question. Not for me, for yourself. I paused. Why didn't you want to know? Silence. I need to think about that, she said finally. I know, I said. Take your time. I put the phone down on the counter. Outside, the south pasture was dark. The cattle were settled. The Cumberland moved the way it always moved, without urgency, without doubt. I heated up what was left of dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table. It was a good evening, as evenings went. The weeks after the hearing moved differently than the weeks before it. Before, there had been the particular tension of waiting, the kind that sits low and quiet in the chest, the kind you carry through morning chores and evening routines without letting it show. After, something loosened, not completely, but enough that I noticed the difference. Justin's formal appeal on the trust ruling came in 10 days, as Louise had predicted. Judge Weston's clerk acknowledged receipt. Louise filed a response. The process would run its course. I stopped tracking it daily and let Louise track it for me. What changed more noticeably was the behavior of the people around me. Lauren DeSantis called on a Tuesday afternoon about 3 weeks after the hearing. I was in the barn when the phone rang, and I answered because I was in a good enough mood not to avoid her. "Fred," she said with the warm concern she deployed for situations she found strategically relevant. "I've been thinking about you." "That's kind, Lauren." "This whole situation must be so exhausting. All those lawyers, the press, you shouldn't have to deal with any of it at your age." A pause that she filled carefully. "I just want you to know that if there's anything I can do, with the farm, with the management side of things, I'm available. I really am." I let a moment pass. "Lauren," I said, "the farm already has a manager." "Oh, I didn't mean, I just thought..." "Take care of yourself," I said, and I ended the call. The farm's manager, if you were curious, was me. Had been for 36 years. I didn't anticipate that changing. Victoria came out the following weekend. She hadn't called ahead. She simply appeared on a Saturday morning in her car, in jeans and an old flannel shirt that I recognized from years ago, and stood at the end of the drive looking at the house like she was making a decision about something. I was on the porch. I watched her for a moment, then went inside and put the kettle on. She came in without knocking, which meant something. She sat at the kitchen table, and we drank coffee without talking for a while. The farmhouse was quiet except for the sound of the cattle in the distance, and a mockingbird that had taken up residence in the old oak by the well. After a while, she said, "I've retained someone for the divorce. I'm not using my own firm." "Smart," I said. "I've been thinking about what you asked me. On the phone." She looked at the coffee cup. "Why I didn't want to know." "You don't have to answer that to me," I said. "I know." She looked up. "But I think I've been answering it to myself, and I wanted you to hear it." She was quiet for a moment. I think I was afraid that if I looked too hard, I'd see something I'd have to act on. And acting on it would mean admitting I'd been wrong. About him. About the last 6 years. She paused. That felt like too much. "Your mother," I said, "used to say that the things we don't look at don't stop being there. They just grow bigger in the dark." Victoria didn't say anything, but her expression shifted in a way I recognized. The shift that means a thing has landed where it was meant to. She stayed for most of the afternoon. She walked the south field with me while I checked the tobacco rows. She didn't help or pretend to know what she was looking at. She just walked alongside, the way she used to when she was small. When she left, she hugged me at the end of the drive. I couldn't remember the last time she'd done that. 2 days later, a message came through Luis from a woman named Carla Oviedo. Luis described her as a contract intermediary representing Zinnia Walters. The message was brief. Zinnia was prepared to provide full testimony against Justin Urban and the operations of Urban Walters Land Consulting in exchange for a written agreement that Fred Evanson would not name her as a defendant in any civil action arising from the trust dispute. I called Luis. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think," he said carefully, That Zinnia Walters has realized that the TBI investigation is going to reach her regardless of what you do. She's trying to limit her exposure on two fronts simultaneously. The testimony she's offering would be genuinely useful to the state, and to us, if we ever pursue civil damages. And if we agree, we retain the right to add her as a defendant later if new information warrants it. But we put that clause in writing, and she'll read it carefully. He paused. It's a reasonable deal, Fred. She's not the primary actor here. I thought for a moment. Justin, whatever else he was, had made all the decisions. Zinnia had been a willing participant, but she hadn't forged my signature, and she hadn't met a judge in a parking lot. Draw up the agreement, I said. The cliffhanger, as Luis later explained it to me, arrived the following Thursday in a document he'd requested through an insurance industry record search. He called me mid-afternoon. His voice carried the particular quality it got when something genuinely unexpected had surfaced. Justin carried an insurance policy on your farm, he said. I didn't say anything immediately. A property and casualty policy, Luis continued, issued in 2023. Insured property. 2,847 Evanson Farm Road, Lebanon, Tennessee, 340 acres. Policy value, $3.8 million. Named insured, Justin R. Urban. A pause. He is not the property owner. He has never been the property owner. How does that work? I asked. On paper, it can't. Not legally. The insurer would have required documentation of an insurable interest. Some legal connection to the property. Either he submitted fraudulent documentation, or someone at the insurer processed this without verifying. He paused again. Either way, we need to know which. I set the phone down for a moment, looked out the window at the north field. Then I picked it back up. Get Walter on it, I said. Walter called me back in 4 days. He had pulled the original insurance application from the State Records Exchange, and he had pulled a second document from the Wilson County Clerk's office. He read both to me on the phone, slowly, so I could write down the key details. The insurance application had been submitted in March 2023 to a mid-sized carrier called Keystone Guarantee Insurance Corp., headquartered in Memphis. In the section requiring documentation of insurable interest, the applicant, Justin Urban, had attached a photocopy of a document that purported to be a power of attorney, naming Justin Urban as the authorized representative of Fred Evanson for purposes of property management and financial decisions. The power of attorney was dated November 2019. It bore what appeared to be Fred Evanson's signature. I have no brother-in-law. I have no power of attorney. I have never signed a document authorizing Justin Urban to act on my behalf in any capacity. In November 2019, as I was able to confirm from my own records, I was in Lebanon, Tennessee, doing nothing more consequential than replacing the water heater in the main farmhouse bathroom. The second document Walter had pulled was the Wilson County repair permit from 2019, the one I'd filed for a fence repair on the north property line in October of that year. My signature was on it. The signatures are consistent, Walter said, the one on the permit and the one on the alleged power of attorney. He traced it, or he had someone trace it. Either way, the power of attorney is fabricated. I was very still for a moment. That's document fraud, I said. Federal, if it crossed state lines. And it did, because the insurance carrier is headquartered in Memphis, and the application was submitted electronically. Walter's voice was level. Insurance fraud and document forgery, both federal offenses. This is a different category than the civil trust dispute, Fred. This is criminal. I called Luis immediately after hanging up with Walter. He already had the documents Walter had forwarded. He was reading them when I called. I'm going to be direct, Luis said. This is the most serious development so far. The trust challenge was a civil matter. The judge situation was potentially criminal, but involved a third party. This, a fabricated power of attorney used to obtain a fraudulent insurance policy. This is something Justin did, himself, to your property, with your forged name. What do we do? I said. Walter takes the full package to the FBI Nashville field office, Luis said. Not TBI, FBI, because of the federal fraud element and the interstate commerce angle. I prepare a supporting affidavit from you confirming you never executed any power of attorney in favor of Justin Urban. We document the signature comparison, and we file. He paused. This will take approximately 11 days from submission to warrant, if the evidence holds up the way I think it will. It held up. 11 days later, on a weekday morning when the air was cold and the sky had that particular flat white quality it gets in Tennessee in late autumn, my neighbor Peter Holloway called me while I was feeding the cattle. "Fred," he said, his voice was strange, "turn on the TV." I went inside. I turned it on. Channel 5 had the breaking news banner across the bottom of the screen. The anchor was saying something about a federal arrest in connection with an ongoing Tennessee Bureau of Investigation case. Then they cut to footage of a building on Drayton Avenue in Nashville, an apartment building, 4 stories, brick facade, and 2 FBI agents walking a man in handcuffs to a waiting car. The man was Justin Urban. He was in a suit that had not been pressed since yesterday. His face was the face of someone who had spent the last 11 days telling himself this wouldn't happen, right up until the moment it did. He did not look at the camera. I watched for 2 minutes. I turned the television off. I went back outside and finished feeding the cattle. That afternoon, from the same kitchen table where I'd read the Banner article 2 months earlier, I called Luis. It went through," he said. "I know. I saw it. The charges are insurance fraud and document forgery, both federal. There will likely be additional counts added as the investigation continues." He paused. "Now for the second part. I'm filing the civil suit this week. We're naming Justin Urban as defendant. The claim is $620,000. Legal fees incurred, lost field rental income from the east parcel during the injunction period, and general damages." "He doesn't have $620,000, I said. "He doesn't," Luis confirmed. "But the civil judgment creates a lien against any assets he has or acquires. It follows him. For 5 years, any income above subsistence can be garnished. The lien attaches to any property. He can't sell, finance, or transfer anything without satisfying it first." He paused. "He will feel this for a long time." I said nothing for a moment. Outside, the east field was brown and still, waiting for spring. "File it," I said. I went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a while. Then my phone rang. It was Victoria. "Dad." Her voice was careful, steady. Not the lawyer voice, but something more honest underneath it. "They served me with a witness subpoena. They want me to testify about conversations Justin and I had about the farm." A pause. "What do I do?" "Do you know the truth?" I said. A brief silence. "Yes." "Then tell it." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Okay." "Victoria," I said, "you're going to be all right?" I meant it. She was going to be. It was simply going to take some time, and time was the one thing I had learned not to be afraid of. I set the phone down and put the kettle on. The cattle were settled. The east field would be ready to plant in spring. The farm was still here. Victoria testified on a Tuesday in the federal district courtroom in Nashville, in a room that smelled of old wood and recycled air, and the particular stillness that courtrooms acquire when something real is being decided. I was not present for her testimony. Luis had advised against it, not for legal reasons, but practical ones. "Her credibility will be stronger," he said, "if the jury sees her as someone acting independently. Your presence makes it look coordinated." I had agreed with his reasoning and stayed at the farm, where I fed the cattle and checked the tobacco seedlings in the cold frame and kept the radio off. She called me that evening. "I told them everything," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that I recognized as earned steadiness, the kind that comes after, not before, a hard thing. "How long?" I asked. 2 hours. Their attorney tried to undermine me on the scheme discussions. "I told them what I told you. Justin spoke about taking the land many times over many years, but I understood it as wishes, not plans. I had no knowledge of Urban Walters, no knowledge of Harvest Global, no knowledge of any forged document." A pause. The prosecutor seemed satisfied. "And Justin?" A brief silence. "He was at the defense table. He didn't look at me once during the entire 2 hours." I thought about that for a moment, about a man who had spent 6 years managing every room he walked into, every conversation, every impression, now sitting still in a room he couldn't manage, unable to meet the eyes of the woman he'd spent those same years steering away from her own judgment. "You did the right thing," I said. "I know," she said. She sounded like she meant it. The full picture of Harvest Global came through the FBI investigation. Harvest Global was a Georgia-registered company controlled through intermediary entities, tracing back to a private investment consortium with partial offshore capitalization. The FBI's international requests were still processing. What was clear, Justin Urban and Zinnia Walters, through Urban Walters Land Consulting, had been lower-level participants in a broader land acquisition strategy targeting agricultural parcels across the Southeast. Justin hadn't invented the scheme. He'd joined it, adapted it to his circumstances, and added his own refinements. The forged power of attorney, the fraudulent insurance policy, those were his independent contributions. He'd been inventive, in his way. It just hadn't helped him. Zinnia Walters had kept her end of the agreement. She had provided detailed testimony about every meeting, every document, every communication between Urban Walters and the Harvest Global representatives. Her account matched Walter Griffin's documentary, evidence point by point. The federal prosecutor told Louise privately that her testimony was, quote, the kind you don't have to coach. Zinnia received a suspended sentence and 2 years of supervised probation with 200 hours of community service. She would not serve time in a federal facility. I had accepted that outcome when I agreed to the deal, and I accepted it again when the sentence was handed down. She had done what she agreed to do. I had done what I agreed to do. That was the transaction. Justin's sentencing came on a Friday morning. Louise attended. I stayed at the farm. The charges, federal insurance fraud, federal document forgery, and obstruction of justice related to the attempt to influence Judge Birch. The federal sentencing guidelines, Louise explained to me beforehand, placed Justin in a range of 41 to 51 months for the combined charges. The judge had discretion within that range. The sentence, 48 months at a federal correctional institution, plus a $380,000 fine payable to the federal government. Designation, FCI Fort Dix, New Jersey. Voluntary surrender date set for 6 weeks from the sentencing date. Louise called me from the parking lot outside the courthouse. Done, he said. Thank you, Louise, I said. He paused. You're welcome, Fred. He paused again. For the record, I've handled a great many agricultural trust cases in this state. I've never seen one prepared as thoroughly as yours was before it reached my desk. Dorothy believed in being ready, I said. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, I said. She really was. 3 days later, I drove to Luis's office on Athens Way. He was waiting with 2 documents on his desk. The first was the civil judgment from the Davidson County Circuit Court, which had ruled on my lawsuit against Justin Urban and Urban Walters Land Consulting, LLC. The judgment, $487,000 from Justin Urban personally, and $133,000 from the LLC, a total of $620,000. Given Justin's current assets, Louise estimated actual recovery at approximately $290,000 over the next 5 years through wage garnishment and asset liens. The remaining amount would be carried as a judgment against him indefinitely. He won't be earning much for the next 4 years, I noted. No, Louise said, but the judgment follows him. When he does earn, we're first in line. I looked at the second document on the desk. It was a letter on heavy paper stock, with the seal of the Tennessee Farmland Conservation Fund at the top. Louise let me read it without interrupting. The letter was addressed to Fred Evanson and signed by the fund's executive director. It contained 2 items. The first, an invitation to join the fund's board of directors, effective upon my acceptance. The second item was a paragraph that I read twice, slowly before I looked up. The fund wished to name its primary protected conservation area in Wilson County. They proposed to call it the Dorothy Evanson Agricultural Preserve. I drove home from Louise's office with the letter on the passenger seat and the windows down. The air was cold and sharp the way early April is in Wilson County. Turned earth and the first green things pushing through. Past the Hargrove property, past the grain silos, past Lebanon city limits, onto the gravel drive. I parked in front of the house and sat in the truck for a moment. Through the windshield I could see the north field and the main barn, in the far corner of the south pasture where the cattle moved in their slow and permanent way. 340 acres that my grandfather had started with 67, and that my father had expanded, and that I had held for 36 years, through drought and bad prices, and a cattle sickness in 2011 that cost me 8 head and one very bad winter. 340 acres that Justin Urban had spent 6 years planning to take, and that were now, irrevocably, legally, permanently, protected from anyone's plans, including his, including mine. I thought, Dorothy, you would have found the right word for this. I can't quite find it, but I think it's something like right. I went inside and made coffee. That evening I called Victoria. She was quiet when I told her about the letter. Then, the Dorothy Evanson Agricultural Preserve. That's what they want to call it. She would have hated being the center of attention like that. She also would have been proud. Both things, I said, usually both things at once with her. Victoria came out the following Saturday. She's been coming most Saturdays since then. The first few times she walked the fields and said almost nothing, and I didn't press. By the third visit, she started asking questions about the seedlings. By the fourth, she was wearing boots she'd ordered online that were the wrong kind for field work, and I didn't say anything about it. They'll wear in. That Saturday, the one that matters, the one I keep coming back to. She asked me to show her how to fly fish. I got the rod down from its hook in the shed, the one that belonged to my father, the same one I'd used the morning of that July picnic. We walked down to the Cumberland in the late afternoon, when the light was flat and the water was running clear over the flat rocks, and I showed her the grip and the stroke, and the way you have to stop thinking about what you're doing before it starts working. She didn't catch anything for the first hour, then she did. A small brown trout, nothing to keep, and she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected. And I heard Dorothy in it, which is a thing I hadn't expected. I released the fish. We walked back to the house. She stayed for dinner and left before dark. As for the others, Zinnia Walters is completing her community service hours at a food bank in East Nashville, according to what I read in a brief banner item. She did not return to journalism. I don't know what her plans are, and I have not inquired. The agreement between us is fulfilled on both sides. Justin Urban reported voluntarily to FCY Fort Dix at the appointed time, 6 weeks after sentencing. The $290,000 I expect to recover from his assets and wages over the next 5 years has been designated in advance. Half to the Dorothy Evanson Agricultural Preserve Endowment Fund, and half toward the reconstruction of the main barn, which was built in 1961 and has needed serious attention for about a decade. The barn will outlast me. The endowment will outlast the barn. The $380,000 federal fine is between Justin and the government. That is not my concern. I think sometimes about the anonymous text. Walter closed that thread months ago. Prepaid device, Memphis, SIM destroyed, no trail, at my instruction. But I haven't closed it entirely. Someone knew about Justin's Harvest Global Agreement before I did. Someone with inside access who chose to warn me instead of staying quiet. I don't know who, and I've considered it from every angle I can find. The gratitude remains, even without a name to attach it to. That's an unusual thing to carry, but not an uncomfortable one. I accepted the board position with the Tennessee Farmland Conservation Fund. The naming ceremony is in May. I'm not a man who enjoys ceremonies, but I'll attend this one without being asked twice. One evening last week, I sat on the porch with the fly rod across my knees, not to fish, just to hold it, and watched the Cumberland catch the last of the light in the way it does in spring when the water is high. I thought about a Saturday last July and a man in a linen shirt who looked at my land and saw dollars, and looked at me and saw an obstacle. I thought about standing in the river, coming out dripping and saying to a man in a linen shirt, "Remember this moment. This is where it ends for you." I hadn't known precisely how, only that it would, and that it would be handled correctly, and that the land would still be here. It is. I am. The river hasn't changed. I went inside. On the kitchen table, in its place, sat the envelope I'd written to myself back in May of last year, before the picnic, before any of it. Do not open until August 15th. I'd opened it the evening I came back from the hotel, in the quiet kitchen with the lamp on and read my own handwriting. If you're reading this, it's done. The farm is protected. Dorothy would be proud. I folded it back along its crease and put it in the drawer with the topographic maps. I put the kettle on. Outside, the south field was dark, and the cattle were quiet, and the first stars were coming up over the tree line to the east. The land was here. The land was protected. That was always the only thing that mattered. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching,